My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never thought my own blood would abandon me when I needed them most. I've lived in Austin, Texas all my life. I raised 3 children with my husband, built a home full of laughter, and believed that family was everything. But life has a cruel way of showing you who really stands by you when the walls collapse. It started with a simple cough that wouldn't go away. At first, I brushed it off as allergies, the kind you get every spring in Texas when the air is thick with cedar pollen. But within weeks, my chest felt heavy, my breath came short, and a strange fatigue clung to me like a shadow. One evening, while making dinner, I collapsed right there on the kitchen floor. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a blindingly white room, machines beeping steadily beside me. An oxygen mask covered my face. My body felt weak, almost foreign. A nurse leaned over and said softly, "Mrs. Mitchell, you're in the ICU. You had severe respiratory failure, but you're stable now. ICU." The words rattled around my skull. I was in the intensive care unit, the place where people fought for their lives. When my family arrived, my husband, Mark, and my children, Jason, Emily, and Sophie, relief surged through me. Their faces hovered above me, blurry but familiar. I wanted to reach for their hands, to cling to them. But what I didn't notice at first was how their expressions weren't filled with fear or grief, but discomfort, almost impatience. "Mom," Emily said with a tight smile, "you're going to be okay." "Don't worry," Jason chimed in, his voice oddly detached. "The doctors are doing everything they can." I tried to speak, but the mask muffled me. My heart ached, not from the illness, but from the strange distance in their voices. 2 days later, I overheard them talking in the hallway when they thought I was asleep. Their voices carried through the thin walls. "We can't just cancel the trip," Jason whispered harshly. "We've been planning it for months. Cancun is non-refundable." "She'll understand," Emily said flatly. "Besides, the doctor said she's stable. It's not like she's dying tomorrow." Sophie's voice, hesitant and small, added, "But what if something happens while we're gone?" Mark cut her off. "Enough, she'll be fine. The nurses are here. We deserve this break." I remember lying there, tears pooling in my eyes, the heart monitor betraying my racing pulse. My family, the very people I had sacrificed everything for, were going to leave me in the ICU while they went on vacation. And that's exactly what they did. The next morning, they kissed my forehead, whispered half-hearted goodbyes, and left. Hours later, I saw their smiling faces on social media, cocktails in hand, sandy beaches behind them. My chest burned with more than illness. It was betrayal, raw and suffocating. I stared at those pictures from my hospital bed, IVs taped to my arm, machines hissing beside me. For days, I replayed their words, their careless laughter, the way they treated me like a burden. Something inside me shifted. The Sarah who had once forgiven every mistake, who had put her family's needs above her own, began to die in that hospital room. And in her place, something new was born. Sharper, colder, stronger. I whispered to myself through cracked lips, "They will regret this. They thought they were leaving me behind to rot." But when they came back from paradise, I would no longer be the fragile woman in the hospital bed. I would be the storm they never saw coming. The days bled together in the ICU, measured not by the sun, but by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Nurses came and went, adjusting my IV, checking my vitals, whispering kind words I knew they didn't have time to mean. But in the silence between their footsteps, I had nothing but my thoughts. And those thoughts grew darker with every photo my family posted online. There they were, my husband Mark and my children, grinning on a yacht in Cancun. Emily posing in a wide-brimmed hat with a margarita in hand. Jason bragging about living the dream. Even Sophie, my youngest, who had always been gentler than the others, was pictured in a swimsuit, laughing as if she had no mother hooked up to machines back in Texas. I stared at those pictures until my vision blurred. And with every laugh they posted, my resolve hardened. I thought about all the years I'd given them. The nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, The double shifts I worked to put Jason through law school, the way I sold my jewelry to help Mark cover his failed business investments. I had poured my entire soul into them, and when I needed them most, they abandoned me for palm trees and cocktails. That betrayal was fuel. I wasn't dead yet. And if fate had kept me alive through this sickness, maybe it was for a reason. To show them that actions have consequences, I began to plan. The first step was survival. I forced myself to eat the bland hospital meals, to do every breathing exercise the nurses begged me to try. I pushed my body harder than I thought possible, telling myself with every labored breath, "You are not going to die here." Not like this. Not on their terms. The second step was information. I asked the nurses questions about my condition, about how long recovery might take. I learned the ins and outs of my diagnosis, how close I had been to death, how fragile my survival still was. Knowledge was power, and I was going to wield it like a weapon. The third step was patience. Revenge is not impulsive. It's a slow burn, a fire that consumes carefully, deliberately. If I rushed, I would fail. No. I would wait until they returned, until their guard was down, until they thought the storm had passed. Then I would strike. Lying in that bed, I pictured it over and over. Mark walking into the house, expecting his obedient wife to smile weakly at him. Emily boasting about her tan. Jason smirking about his adventures. Sophie pretending innocence. And me, no longer their fragile mother and wife, but the woman who had seen the truth and would no longer be controlled by love or obligation. The thought gave me strength. On the fifth day, a nurse named Rachel leaned over and whispered, "Mrs. Mitchell, you're getting stronger. You'll be out of here sooner than we thought." I smiled, though my lips trembled. "Good," I said softly, "because I have unfinished business." She laughed lightly, thinking I was joking. But inside, I wasn't laughing. Meanwhile, my family's posts grew bolder. Mark, shirtless on the beach, captioned, "Finally free." Those words cut deeper than any scalpel. Free from what? From me? From the woman who kept his world together for decades? That night, I couldn't sleep. The beeping of the monitors felt like a countdown, ticking toward their return. I imagined their faces when they walked through that hospital door, smug and sun-kissed, thinking I'd welcome them back with open arms. But instead, they'd find a different Sarah, the Sarah who would teach them what it feels like to be abandoned, to be betrayed, to be left gasping for breath while the people you love choose luxury over loyalty. I whispered into the sterile darkness, my voice hoarse but steady. "When you come back, you'll wish you never left." And for the first time since the collapse, I felt alive. The day they returned, the Texas heat was merciless, pressing down on the hospital walls like punishment from above. I was already sitting upright, hair brushed, a little color back in my cheeks. I wanted to look strong, not fragile, when they walked through the door. When the door finally creaked open, Mark entered first, his skin tanned, his smile wide. He looked more alive than he had in years. Emily and Jason followed, both glowing from sun and luxury. Sophie trailed behind, her eyes flickering nervously toward me. "Sarah," Mark said warmly, as if he hadn't just left me for dead. "Look at you. You're doing so much better." His voice grated on my ears. I smiled faintly, but inside a storm churned. "Yes," I rasped. "Better." Emily plopped into the chair beside my bed, scrolling through her phone. "You wouldn't believe how amazing Cancun was. The water was crystal clear and the food, oh, Mom, you would have loved it." I studied her carefully. Not once did she apologize for leaving me behind. Not once did she ask how close I had come to dying. Jason leaned against the wall, grinning. "And the clubs, Mom. You wouldn't believe—" I cut him off with a soft cough. I'm sure it was unforgettable. My voice carried no warmth, though none of them seemed to notice. Only Sophie looked at me with guilt swimming in her eyes. She fiddled with the hem of her shirt, unable to meet my gaze. I stored that away. Sophie wasn't innocent, but she wasn't heartless like the others. That night, after they left to rest from their trip, I sat in my hospital bed and made my next move. The nurses had already mentioned discharge within a week. Perfect timing. I would go home, and from there I would begin planting seeds. Seeds of doubt, seeds of fear, seeds that would make them question everything they took for granted. When I was discharged, Mark drove me home. The mansion sat gleaming under the Texas sun, the house I had built with years of sweat and sacrifice. Walking inside felt different this time, no longer like a safe haven, but a battlefield. "Make yourself comfortable, honey," Mark said, almost dismissively. "We'll help you settle back in." I gave him a smile that didn't touch my eyes. Of course. The first few days I observed them. Emily lounged by the pool, bragging on the phone to her friends about escaping the stress of Mom's illness. Jason spent his time at the gym or out with buddies, avoiding responsibility. Mark buried himself in finances, always muttering about money. I noticed it immediately. Their greed. Mark had started looking at me not as his wife, but as an obstacle between him and my life insurance. Emily asked probing questions about my will. Jason joked about inheriting the house someday. They thought I didn't notice. But I did. And I would use it against them. My first step was subtle. I began leaving documents out, fake ones, carefully crafted with the help of a lawyer friend I still trusted. Papers suggesting I was rewriting my will, notes about donations to charity, hints that the fortune they expected to inherit might vanish into the hands of strangers. I watched as they found these papers. Emily's face went pale. Jason cursed under his breath. Mark tried to hide his irritation, but I saw his jaw clench. The seeds were planted. Next, I began dropping small lies, truths twisted just enough to sound real. I whispered to Sophie one evening, "I heard your father talking about selling the house without telling you kids." Her eyes widened. Later, I told Emily, "Jason mentioned moving into my master suite after I'm gone." And to Jason, I said, "Emily wants to control the estate. She thinks you'll waste it all." Like clockwork, they began to turn on each other. Small arguments erupted at the dinner table. Emily snapped at Jason. Jason rolled his eyes at Emily. Mark scolded them both, his patience thinning. I sat quietly, sipping tea, hiding my smile. They had left me in the ICU to chase sunshine and cocktails. Now, I was poisoning their paradise at home. But this was only the beginning. The real revenge would come when I revealed just how much they had underestimated me. For now, I waited, silent and watchful, as my family began to crack under the weight of their own greed. And I whispered to myself as I drifted off to sleep, "This house will not be your vacation. It will be your prison." The Texas nights were hot, but the tension inside the house burned hotter. By the end of the first week back, my little family no longer laughed at the dinner table. Conversations that once revolved around vacations, plans, and luxuries had turned into veiled accusations, biting remarks, and heavy silence. I sat at the head of the table, recovering strength with each passing day. My body healed, but so did my resolve. I had been left in that ICU bed like forgotten luggage, and now, every time I watched Emily's smug smile or Mark's calculating stare, I knew I was right. Revenge wasn't just justice, it was survival. Emily was the first to crack. One evening, she stormed into my room without knocking, her face pale and tense. "Mom," she whispered urgently, "is it true you're changing the will? That you're giving everything to charity?" I tilted my head, feigning surprise. "Where did you hear that, sweetheart?" Jason told me. "He said you've been meeting with lawyers." I let out a soft sigh. Jason worries too much. But then again, I have been considering some changes. After all, not everyone deserves a fortune they haven't earned. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You mean Jason, right? He's irresponsible. He doesn't deserve it. I'd take care of it all. I'd keep it safe." The desperation in her voice almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I reached for her hand. "Emily, dear, if I decide to change anything, you'll know. Trust me." Of course, she didn't realize those words meant nothing. Trust was a currency I'd stopped spending. 2 days later, Jason came to me. His fists were clenched, anger radiating off him. "Mom, Emily said you're giving her control of the estate. That true?" I raised my brows, pretending to look hurt. "Jason, why would I favor one child over another? Unless, of course, one of you had proven untrustworthy." His eyes darkened. "She's lying. I knew it. She wants it all." "Perhaps," I murmured, letting the words linger like poison in his mind. That night, their fight shook the house. I listened from my room as Emily and Jason screamed at each other, accusing, insulting, cursing. Mark tried to intervene, but his own frustration boiled over. He slammed doors, shouted, and ended up drinking himself into a stupor. The cracks were widening, and I wasn't finished. The next morning, I asked Sophie to help me bake cookies, something normal, something innocent. She looked relieved to escape the chaos. As we worked side by side in the kitchen, I leaned closer. "Sophie, dear," I said softly, "do you know why your father and siblings fight so much now?" She frowned. "Because of money? Because they think I won't be around much longer." I gave her a sad smile. "They see me as a bank account. Not as a mother, not as a person. But you still see me, don't you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Of course I do, Mom." I kissed her forehead. "Good girl. Then you'll help me, won't you? You'll help me make sure they don't destroy what I've built." She nodded without hesitation. I had her loyalty now. By the end of the week, I set my next trap. I left a fake bank statement on the counter, one that showed millions being quietly transferred into an account under Sophie's name. It was easy enough to forge with my lawyer friend's help. I made sure Emily saw it first. Her scream rattled the walls. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, waving the paper at Mark. "She's giving everything to Sophie? Are you kidding me?" Jason snatched the statement from her and cursed. "This is bulls." "Sophie, she's a kid." Mark's face turned red. "Sarah, what is this about?" I sat calmly in my chair, sipping tea. "Oh, that? Just some arrangements I've been considering. Sophie has been kind to me. More than I can say for the rest of you. Their outrage was delicious." Emily broke down crying. Jason stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Mark just stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. And maybe he was. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fans spinning lazily above me. The sound of muffled arguments drifted down the hallway. My family was breaking apart piece by piece, and I was the one pulling the strings. But revenge is never complete with cracks alone. Cracks weaken the foundation, yes, but the house doesn't fall until you strike it hard enough. I had more to do. The next morning, I called an old friend from church, a woman who loved to gossip. I told her a few concerns about Mark's finances, how he might be planning to sell the house behind my back, how Emily was scheming to control everything. I knew she would spread it like wildfire. By evening, neighbors were whispering. By the next day, I received sympathetic looks in town. By the third day, Mark confronted me, furious. "You told people I'm broke?" He snapped. I shrugged. "I just told them what I've seen." "You do spend a lot of time with those bank files." His fist slammed against the wall. "You're trying to ruin me." I met his glare with a calm, cold stare. "No, Mark, you ruined yourself when you left me to die in that hospital bed." His face went pale. For once, he had no comeback. That night, I knew I had him. The man who once controlled everything in this house now looked like a cornered animal. Emily and Jason distrusted each other more with each passing day. Sophie clung to me like I was her lifeline. It was perfect. But the sweetest part of revenge was yet to come. Because once you've made your enemies paranoid, once you've made them fight among themselves, the next step is to make them beg. For your forgiveness, for your mercy, for crumbs of the empire they thought they'd inherit, and I was going to make them crawl. By the time autumn rolled in, the house I had built with Mark felt like a theater where everyone performed their parts badly. The masks had slipped. The fractures were visible. The jostling for inheritance had become a daily spectacle. But cracks and whispers weren't enough anymore. If I wanted them truly broken, If I wanted them to understand what it feels like to be abandoned, I needed to expose them where it hurt most: reputation, freedom, and the fragile illusion of control they clung to. I started with the easiest target, Mark. He had always been careless with details when pride clouded fear. Years ago, I had overlooked small signs: late-night phone calls, odd withdrawals, a quiet lunch with a business associate I'd never met. When I recovered enough strength, I quietly asked Richard to pull a discreet review of some account histories. We already had access to enough small clues to make a pattern. What he found was worse than I expected. Mark had been siphoning company funds into a shadow account to try to salvage a failed venture. It wasn't billion-dollar theft, but for a man with a fragile ego and no clean alibi, it was career suicide. I printed the balance sheets, read circles around suspicious transfers, and slipped them to a trusted auditor at his firm. I didn't need to shout. I just let the right person find the right paper. Within days, Mark's trustworthy partners were asking awkward questions. A quiet audit turned into an urgent meeting with legal counsel. The man who had casually told me he needed a break for a vacation now had to defend his integrity to people he'd once charmed. Mark's face, when the first notice came, reddened. Incredulous than raw fear was a small piece of justice. While Mark reeled, I turned my attention to Jason. He'd thrown around swagger and legal jargon at parties, but swagger doesn't pay for the type of debts he'd quietly accumulated. Jason had been courting the wrong crowd, a man in his firm who promised fast returns and easy access to off-books clients. The favors Jason had cashed in had strings, some illegal, some only morally bankrupt. A few months earlier, I caught a cryptic text on his unlocked phone, something about closing a deal and a meeting at midnight. I'd filed a copy away. I called an old friend at the state bar, someone who owed me a favor, and asked if he could quietly check a couple of case files. He did, and he found a trail. A client who'd been bilked after signing under duress, accusations that could be traced back to deals Jason had facilitated. We bundled the text, the time-stamped emails I'd had Richard print, and a sworn statement from the one claimant who agreed to speak. Jason was shaken to the core the day investigators quietly asked him to come in for a chat. There were no cameras, no dramatic arrests, just the polite, clinical pull of the law. The humiliation when men he'd tried to impress looked at him like a stranger was exquisite. Emily was a different animal altogether, socially connected, media-savvy, and skilled at controlling narratives. But she had a soft underbelly, vanity. She loved the idea of being liked, of being celebrated. So I gave the town and their small circle something they could tweet about. I forgot my charity luncheon guest list at dinner, a list with highlighted names, including Emily, and a fake note about a scandalous embezzlement rumor involving her socialite pals. The gossip mill went to work. Influencers I knew from decades on boards took the bait, asking pointed questions, pausing mid-Instagram story to mention an odd rumor. Emily's carefully curated life unraveled not with a single blow, but with the tiny, stinging cuts of people unfollowing her, sponsors pausing deals, and invitations that never arrived. She messaged me furious tears and threats. I sat with a cup of tea and let her panic unfold without interference. When an old friend publicly asked a question about Emily's sources of donations, and the rumor ballooned, Emily finally understood what it felt like for the town to turn. She, who had spent her life polishing an image, now had it corroded. I didn't want to wreck Sophie. She had always been soft-eyed and true. She had slept beside me in the hospital some nights, and brought me orange juice the mornings I felt the worst. She still called, bringing small comforts. For Sophie, I wanted a shield, not a pyre. I asked her to help with small tasks, organizing the family archives, reading aloud letters from my late husband that I hadn't had the courage to face. I gave her meaningful work, a way to anchor herself to something honest amidst the chaos. Her loyalty became the one clean thing in that house, and for that I loved her fiercely. But the most satisfying part of my plan wasn't the legal whisper campaigns or the town gossip. It was watching them turn on each other. I fed Jason a tip, anonymous of course, about Emily's big donor who might want exclusivity, I told Emily a small fib about Jason's late-night meetings with someone at the firm. I hinted to Mark that his name had been floated in boardroom rumors about embezzlement. The result was delicious. A family supper that devolved into a trapdoor of accusations. Accusations that had been seeded by me, true in part and twisted enough to destroy the illusions they fed one another. Voices rose. Tears were shed. Doors slammed. That night, sleep fled their faces. Word reached my doctors that stress was affecting my recovery. Too much drama could undo the progress. I let the nurses worry. They saw a brave woman who had been through a terrifying illness and was now fighting to reclaim a life. They did not see the strategist who had methodically set the board. When a well-meaning nurse told me gently to take it easy, I patted her hand and smiled. I will, I lied, because my body could rest now that my mind had a mission. One evening, when the house was quiet and the moon painted long silver lines across the carpet, Jason stumbled into my study, eyes bloodshot, guilt written in every line of his face. He sat without being invited. "Mom," he said, voice barely a whisper. I didn't know it would go this far." He looked like a frightened boy, not the man who'd braggadocioed in Cancun. "You left me," I said simply. "No need for theatrics." "You all left me," he swallowed. "We were wrong. We don't deserve what?" I asked, letting the silence bite. "To have my forgiveness, perhaps? To be spared consequences for your actions?" "No." I reached out and took his hand. The gesture was small, but my grip was iron. "You will have to earn it." He nodded, a man stripped of bluff and bravado. He finally understood that my revenge wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was painful retribution that taught them a simple lesson. Actions have consequences. They had chosen paradise over their mother's life. They would now choose to rebuild trust if they could. Outside, the night hummed with crickets. Inside, a family that once towered above me in my own life was beginning to crumble. The slow, inevitable collapse had started. But the final act, the one that would leave them broken, humbled, and changed, was still to come. And I intended to finish it soon. The house had grown quiet in a way that felt final. The fights had simmered into sharp silences. The accusations and threats had been spoken and could not be unspoken. For months I had watched them unravel, watched Mark's confident grin curdle into fear, watched Jason's bravado wash away to reveal a frightened boy, watched Emily's glossy life lose its shine. Sophie stayed, a small calm at my side, a steady presence that soothed the wounds I still carried from that winter in the ICU. But revenge is not simply about watching the ruin. It is about delivering the last, undeniable truth so that no lies can claw their way back. I'd built my campaign carefully. Auditors and lawyers, a loyal friend at the newspaper who loved a scandal, quiet meetings with people who'd once owed me favors. All the threads braided into one final pull. The curtain was ready to drop. It began with a letter delivered to the offices that had once adored Mark, the board of the regional trust, the partners in the real estate ventures he'd used as cover. I'd compiled the evidence slowly, methodically, the withdrawals, the unapproved transfers to shell vendors, the off-books payments he'd hidden in the name of consulting. The letter was short, clinical, and devastating. I did not need to insult him in public. The documents would do that work. Within 48 hours, Mark was called into a private meeting. He returned home that evening with the hollow look of a man whose life had just been unmade. A cold, professional letter about an internal audit, a freeze on account access, a suggestion, gentle, then not, that he step aside while the board investigated. He tried to soldier through it, but pride bled away like water through a sieve. He had spent a life convincing the world he was indispensable. Suddenly, no one would take his calls. Then I turned to Jason. The small files I'd prepared, texts, timestamps, a corroborating witness who had agreed to speak, were delivered to the county prosecutor quietly. It was not my desire to see my son dragged through a courtroom, but I had promised consequences. When investigators came to ask questions, Jason's face when the polite officer casually asked about certain midnight transactions told me more than any confession. He looked ashamed, and shame is sometimes the first step toward humility. Emily's fall was slower, more public. I fed a single, carefully sourced tip to an old friend who still wrote for the lifestyle section that loved a scandal disguised as charity gossip. It took only a whisper of a question, an inquiry into underwriting and donations, and suddenly Emily's name was attached to inconsistencies and awkward explanations. Sponsors paused contracts. A civic committee rescinded an invitation. When those public doors closed, Emily's social world thinned like a stage with too few props. She called me, then texted, then finally came to stand in my kitchen with mascara tracks on her cheeks and a voice that was small and brittle. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to—" Her apology came out like an exhausted confession. It was not an easy place to stand, to receive tearful contrition from a child who had once left me in a hospital bed to chase cocktails. But what revenge had taught me was not the lust for cruelty. It had taught me the wisdom of measured mercy. I could punish, yes, I had punished, but I could also choose to teach. Emily's glossy life had been stripped so that she might learn empathy instead of entitlement. I wanted my children to survive this and be different on the other side. Mark, however, was the hardest. Pride makes men dangerous in two ways. It blinds them and it refuses to die. He raged, begged, struck out at his old partners, and even accused me in private of orchestrating every blow. He loved to tell himself he'd always been the one holding the family together, but his attacks only revealed how small he felt. Later, when his phone calls turned to whispers to me in the dark hours, he asked, quietly, how to fix it. "Start by telling the truth," I said simply. "Tell them you were wrong. Apologize. Prove you can be accountable." He scoffed at first, then tried. He made statements to the board. He opened his accounts for auditing. He began to cooperate where he had previously lied. It was not forgiveness, not at first, but a slow reparation, the kind that must be earned. If he had wanted a shortcut, he would have taken it before the ICU. He had no shortcuts now. As the weeks passed, court dates were scheduled. Jason faced a quiet hearing and a reprimand with conditions. His career teetered but did not collapse entirely. Mark's fate was more ambiguous. The board pushed for a settlement that would protect their investors, but leave him with a tarnished reputation. Emily, stripped of her glossy veneer, retreated to do the deeper, harder work of repairing relationships she'd once thought trivial. Sophie stayed close, the soft thread that held us together. She began handling small matters at the house, organizing, filing, making sure the charity events I still believed in were done with integrity. I encouraged her, taught her the parts of the business my illness had made me look at differently. She surprised me with a steely resolve that did not shock me, because she had been the one who'd sat by my IV and read me silly books to make me laugh. She had the heart to learn stewardship, not entitlement. There was an echo of irony that I did not miss. The very community that had once admired our family now watched us with sharp interest. Some judged, some whispered, some offered sympathy. The press fed the story's appetites, but also forced responsibility to the surface. I used the attention not for vengeance, though I admit it was satisfying to watch the truth spread, but to explain, to teach, and to protect what mattered. One cool evening, months after the ICU, I hosted a small gathering, not a grand party, but a table set for those who still cared for genuine work. I invited Sophie, some neighbors, a couple of trusted board members, and even a representative from the hospital who had cared for me when my breaths were stolen. Mark came late, contrite, dressed in a humility he'd never worn. We spoke of small things first, recipes and the oddity of Texas weather, then of the deeper currents. I told stories of Mark's good moments, the man who'd once been full of kindness before greed and fear took over. I told tales of my late husband's stubborn kindness and how we'd always tried to give back. The guests listened, and somewhere between the pie and the coffee, the family began to clear some smoke. When the night wound down, Mark pulled me aside. His voice was rough. "I'm trying, Sarah." He said the words without bravado, without excuse. I know I don't deserve it. No, I answered. You don't deserve it, but you might earn it. My voice was not soft. It was honest. Start by being present. Start by telling Sophie the truth. Start by helping Jason pick up his life. Start by apologizing to Emily in public. He nodded. It was not the big, cinematic forgiveness scene I had once believed in. It was the hard, daily work that may or may not yield roses. It was the kind of penance that takes longer than any vacation. And I had what I wanted. I had made them feel the ache of abandonment. I had reclaimed my power. The house was mine to steward now, frayed, yes, but with a clean center. I used my estate to fund programs for caregivers, for people who had been left behind quietly and painfully. I rebuilt some of the trusts that had been endangered by greed, ensured Sophie had meaningful stewardship training, and set up a scholarship in the name of my late husband. The money did not define me. How it served others did. In the quiet after the storm, I sometimes thought about that night in the ICU, about the white lights and the beeping machines and the whispers in the hall. I had nearly died not just from illness, but from being taken for granted. That pain had made me dangerous in the only way I could accept. I learned to protect myself. The last time I saw Olivia, my neighbor who had quietly collected gossip and who once told me she admired the life I led, she hugged me and said, "You handled it beautifully, Maggie." The word beautiful felt strange, but I nodded. Revenge had been a tool. Justice, a duty. Mercy, a rare gift I could choose to give. Sitting in my garden years later, Sophie at my side, and the house humming with steady life, I realized the final truth. Family is a construct we must constantly tend. You can forgive without forgetting, and you can rebuild without erasing scars. The ICU taught me one more thing. Breath is precious, and the people who choose to stay when you are most vulnerable are the ones worth keeping. I lifted my teacup to my lips, felt the warmth seep into my palms, and smiled. Life had given me back a hard-earned peace.